Excuse me, sorry to bother you all, but I need some help. If I could get some help, it's my friend. He can't move. He just sort of lies there, kind of twitching a bit, and he has this really scary blank stare, and I don't know what to do. But I thought maybe if I could just get a few of you, just to help me. If you would just take one corner here. Maybe you could grab a corner here. No? Yeah. If you give me a hand here, I think between here, right on this side. Yeah. And between the four of us, I think we can get him to Jesus. I think it'll be easier. In some ways, it's not that surprising to me that he ended up like this. He's been having a really rough time lately. He couldn't get any work, and he couldn't pay his bills. He couldn't pay his taxes, and he went into debt. I mean, what was he supposed to do? He had to feed his children, but then, let's get him up here. Then when he couldn't pay his debts, they took away his house. And they sold his children into slavery. And then he just went from bad to worse. He stopped eating. Didn't have any food anyways, but he stopped eating. He couldn't get out of bed in the morning, and he kept saying that it was all his fault. I tried to tell him it wasn't, that he shouldn't feel bad, but he wouldn't listen. It got worse and worse, and I didn't know what to do. But then today, it was just like this. Not moving at all. I was so scared. But I thought maybe if we get him to Jesus, they'll be all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the ladder, we're going to climb up on the roof, we're going to dig through. But I think we need to catch our breaths first. So let's put him down. Let's put him down here for a second. And And you know what? Why don't you guys go sit down for a minute? I'll let you know when I'm ready. And I wish I knew what was wrong with him. Mark doesn't give us too many hints in his gospel as to exactly what's wrong with this guy. He says he's paralyzed, but all kinds of things can cause paralysis. Different things. I mean, our first assumption might, of course, be that he's some sort of quadriplegic, that maybe he had some really bad injury that ruined his spine. And I guess that could be, but actually it doesn't seem all that likely, does it? Because chances are, given the time and the place, that he really wouldn't survive that kind of injury. So maybe it's something else. Mark actually does give us a few other hints as to what might have been wrong with him. For one thing, Jesus actually treats this man different from just about every other person that he heals. Almost every other person that he talks to, he actually talks with them, asks them questions about their faith. But Jesus doesn't talk to this man. Doesn't converse with him anyways. Which suggests to me that maybe he is unresponsive. Jesus speaks to his friends, talks about their faith, but he doesn't speak with the man. So maybe there was a good reason for that. He just wasn't kind of there. He was unresponsive. And there's one more hint as to his condition to be found in Jesus' response to him. Because there's another odd way in which Jesus responds to him. He doesn't speak to him of healing. He doesn't speak to him of his physical condition, but rather speaks to him kind of surprisingly about forgiveness. He says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And in fact, Jesus gets into a fair bit of trouble for saying that. So he must not have said it lightly. He must have had a good reason. Which suggests to me that maybe this man's condition was somehow connected to feelings of guilt. So, the question is, what kind of condition that might be related to feelings of guilt could possibly cause both paralysis and unresponsiveness? And when you put the question that way, the answer for me is actually kind of obvious. I think that this man in the Gospel of Mark was in a catatonic state. And what happens when someone is in a catatonic state is that their body becomes rigid. Almost completely motionless, though sometimes there's a bit of a twitching motion. And what's more, when someone's in a catatonic state, they have this blank stare. And they do not react to external stimuli. What's more, a catatonic state is generally related to various forms of mental or psychological illness. It is connected to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and severe depression. So you know what I think it was? I think that this guy was depressed, severely depressed. So severely depressed that he went into a catatonic state. And it really does kind of fit the situation, it fits the story. It fits the economic circumstances in first century Palestine. It was a rough time. People were deep in debt. Because of their debts, they were losing their family farms. They were being sold into slavery, losing their freedom. It is exactly the kind of situation that can plunge people deep, deep into despair. And what's more, depression is actually often connected to feelings of guilt. Feelings of guilt are a big trigger for depression. Now often, as it turns out, the guilt that people feel that leads to depression is often guilt that they should not feel. That is to say, people have been made to feel guilty for things they should not feel guilty for. Things, perhaps, that they had no control over. Or in some cases, people have had a crime or some abuse committed against them. And yet they have been made to feel as if that crime was their own fault. The victim is blamed for the crime. But the thing about feelings of guilt is this: it doesn't necessarily matter where those feelings come from, whether they come from something you really did wrong or something you were made to feel bad for. Those feelings of guilt still have that same devastating effect on a person and can definitely lead to severe depression. So I think that's what it was. This man was so deeply sunk into despair that it actually put him into a catatonic state. He was that bad, and he came to Jesus, and Jesus healed him of that. And I know how some people might hear that. Some people might hear that as me trying to minimize the miracle that Jesus performed by suggesting that he merely healed someone who was suffering from a mental illness, as if that were somehow less. I know that's what some people might assume, but it's not right. For mental illness is no less devastating, no less destructive than other forms of illness. And a broken spirit can be as debilitating as a broken arm or a broken back. And I've been there with people in severe depression, and I know that sometimes to break them out of that place takes a miracle no less amazing than it does to take someone, to heal someone with a broken back. So I'm not in the least trying to minimize what Jesus did for this man. It was miraculous. It was amazing. And I think that maybe it is good to take a few moments to look at how Jesus does really help this man, what he really does for him. For in that, I think there might also be a model for us as we seek sometimes to help others. Note this, the first thing that Jesus does for him is this. Jesus speaks to him with love. Jesus calls him son. Look through the Gospels. Jesus does not do that often. He does not speak to people with that sort of term of endearment, but to this man he does. He speaks to him like family. And that is, I think, an expression of love. Now already this man is fortunate because he clearly has 4 friends who love him deeply, who love him dearly. But Jesus piles on and throws on more love, an overabundance of love. And I think that is key because love, unconditional love, unconditional acceptance for a person as they are, is the platform upon which healing can be built. It is the first step. Secondly, Jesus speaks to this man of forgiveness and the grace of God. Son, he says, your sins are forgiven. And I love how he says it. Because he does not say, son, your sins will be forgiven if you do this or if you do that. There are no conditions. Nor does he say, son, your sins were forgiven, but now you got to straighten up. No, the grace and the forgiveness that he speaks of is present, active, right now. Blanket forgiveness, covering all. And I think that is key. Because as I said, there is often a strong connection between depressions and feelings of guilt. And as I said, often those feelings of guilt are unnecessary. The person has no reason to feel them, but has been made to feel them. But wherever that guilt comes from, wherever those feelings come from, they need to be addressed. And that's why being able to come to someone and offering grace and forgiveness, the abundant, unlimited grace of God, can be so key. That's what Jesus offers. Again, absolutely essential for building healing and new beginnings. And I believe that we, as followers of Jesus Christ, we are uniquely placed to offer that kind of grace and forgiveness to people without strings attached. And then finally, after the love has been established, after the grace has been established, only then does Jesus call on this man to act. Stand up, he says, take up your mat and go to your home. And of course, it is essential at some point to call on someone to start to take responsibility for their own life, for their own mood. It is an essential thing, and that is what Jesus is doing here. But note when he does it. Only after the love is established. Only after the grace has been poured out. It's the only time when there's a chance of getting us anywhere. Jesus heals the man. Now I am kind of speculating here. We don't really know what might have caused the paralysis in this man in the gospel story. I think it might have been depression. I don't know. But of course, the bottom line for this man was not what caused his paralysis, but what set him free, and Jesus set him free. But nevertheless, I think that this man, lying motionless on his mat, is a perfect symbol of those who struggle with depression. Because paralysis is a key symptom of depression. Yet not often does it go so far as to put someone in a catatonic state, but various forms of paralysis short of that are very common in depression. People feel that they cannot move. They cannot move forward in their lives. They cannot go into what they perceive as threatening situations. Some cannot move from their beds, cannot go out the door of their home. This sense of being stuck, unable to move, is very common. So I see him as an excellent representative symbol of those who struggle with depression. And if that is who he represents, let me tell you something, he represents many among us in our society today. I don't know if you know this, but we are living in a time when there is essentially an epidemic of depression. It is more common today than any time that has ever been observed in medical history. And not only is depression more often to be found among us, it is often deeper, more intractable, hard to break someone out of today than has been observed before. And this is despite the frequent prescription and use of antidepressants in our society, ever increasing. Or maybe it's even because of it, I don't know. The question is, if we are living in a time when there is an epidemic of depression, what is the role of the church? Who are we supposed to be living in the world at such a time as this? And I can find no better symbol of what the church ought to be in the world today than who the four men in this gospel story. The four men who were frightened. Frightened by what they saw in their friend. Frightened by his paralysis. Frightened by his non-responsiveness, his depression. But nevertheless did what they could to get him to Jesus. Did not let any barriers, not a huge crowd, not a barred door, not a climb up a ladder carrying a very awkward burden, not a solid, dry mud roof. Let nothing stand in the way of getting their friend to Jesus. Who is the church? Who are we called to be today? We are called to be the hole in the roof gang. We are called to be the people who will do anything to get our friends who are struggling from depression or whatever it may be to Jesus. Now what that looks like, what that practically looks like, will differ from case to case. Getting someone to Jesus may not necessarily mean getting them to church, at least not initially. Sometimes getting someone to Jesus may mean that you got to get them to the doctor first or to the psychiatrist. May mean that medication is part of the story. Sure. You see, all of those things that we do for people, really just our way of getting through the barriers, of digging through the roof. The goal is to get them to Jesus. The goal is to get them to the place where they can hear and believe the words, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Son, daughter, you don't have to carry the weight. You don't have to carry those feelings of shame or whatever it is that's bearing you down. You can be free of that. You are loved. You are valuable. You are forgiven. Then and only then, get up, take up your mat, go to your home, go to the place where God has called you to be. Will you take a few moments in silence?